Good morning, church. Welcome to Sunday. So, I want to center us as we begin to jump into the next stage of our covenant discussion. Just take a moment, just breathe in the air. We're going to be talking about Noah's Ark today, and I imagine that the air you're breathing is much better than it would have been for Noah 40 days into his adventure with animals and smells and sounds. So just take a moment and breathe fresh air in. And think about what it also might have been when they leave that ark and come onto a new land, refreshed, renewed. Sometimes we find our own lives become a little bit like the ark, right? They're frustrating, they're loud, they're smelly, they feel like chaos. And yet, we're reminded God also invites us to leave that behind us, to walk into a new beginning, a new start. So if you need that new start, that out of the ark mentality, I want to give you that moment to think about today, to move forward into a new direction, a new beginning, because that's what's happening in this story. Sometimes we actually, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, sometimes we actually say this is one of the creation stories. There are creation stories throughout the Bible. There's that 2 right at the beginning of creation. There's one in Job, and there's one here again in Noah. This recreation of the world. Now we're talking about covenants. And if you haven't seen last week's sermon, that preps you for what's going on about covenants. But I also just will give you this from Bible.org because it's a quick reminder of why it's important to talk about covenants. They say ours is not an age that desires to make long-term commitments. The covenant of marriage is often avoided, and vows that are made lack the permanence and commitment of former days. Guarantees are given for a very short period. Contracts are often vaguely worded or undermined by loopholes and fine print. We don't have the tendency anymore, do we, to have this notion of commitment that is so long-term. What's going to happen in this covenant that we see with Noah is a universal covenant, an everlasting covenant, and that kind of language might freak us out. But it all begins with this covenant. Now, there are people who are literally called covenant theologians. Now, theologian, theo, God, and then logian, study of God. So most clergy or theologians, academics that work at divinity schools or write biblical texts, those kind of people are theologians. But there are people who literally call themselves covenant theologians. This is an area of discussion. And the Noahic covenant is the one we start with. Now, almost everybody in the world knows the study of Noah, knows the story of Noah. It makes me think of some of the Noah jokes that I've heard. Anybody need a boat? I know a guy. How did Noah see the animals in the ark at night? With flood lighting. Some say that Noah is the craziest of biblical figures. Building the ark, gathering animals, the whole thing seems delusional. I know, there's some crazy ones out there. But there's also pictures of ark jokes, right? There's one of Noah looking at the ark as there's water coming in through it and shaking his head saying, "Why did I bring 2 termites?" So if you feel like you need a little Noah fun, just type in Noah jokes online because you're going to find a lot more like that, right? This idea of Noah appeals to society, right? This 2x2 animals. Kids love this. We always talk about Noah in Sunday school. You know, you pretty much can't grow up in Sunday school without having heard the story of Noah, but society itself tells this story of Noah. Right? This man who is called by God to build an ark, to bring his family and the family of animals in the world into the ark because the rest of humanity not doing so good, right? So they get on this ark together, they ride through the waters together, and then 40 days, which if you remember, the number 40 means a long term. So a long time later, they get off the ark, they start a new life, right? That's such a great story. In fact, people love it so much that now in Kentucky, there is the Ark Encounter, a full-size Noah's Ark, built with the dimensions from the Bible even, spanning 510 feet long, 85 feet wide, 51 feet high. And this whole notion of what it would have been like, it appeals to many people's minds, right? To think about what it would have been like to be on board a boat with lions and tigers and bears and little rabbits and little kittens. Right? This appeals to us as humans, but there's something much deeper in the Noahic covenant. Now, I want to start right away by saying Noahic, as in Noah, is really the name we give it because it's given to Noah, but it's not just given to Noah. The recipients of this covenant are broader than Noah and his descendants. This first covenant is to you and to me. This first covenant, as we'll see later, is to animals and creation. So while we call it the Noahic covenant, you could also just think of it as the first real covenant. And what makes this so important? Well, the fact of the Noah covenant is we see this beginning of covenant theology, this beginning of making commitments, making promises. God's going to lay out for us how to make commitments to each other, how to guide society, what's right. Much of the Noahic covenant helps us to see how we should act as people, as communities, as the world. One major thing right away to know about the Noahic covenant is that it is initiated and dictated by God alone. While other covenants are going to be kind of a negotiation between God and humanity, this covenant is all God. God is clearly sovereign here. God has the power. God is like both parties in this discussion. A lot of the ancient covenants are really like a back and forth kind of thing. But here God tells us what this covenant's about. There's no discussion with Noah. There's no thought. There's no responsibility of Noah. And we know how important this covenant is going to be later on because we even see it referenced in Isaiah 54, 9 through 10. For this is like the days of Noah to me when I swore that the waters of Noah should not flood the earth again. So I have sworn that I will not be angry with you, nor will I rebuke you. For the mountains may be removed and the hills may shake, but my loving kindness will not be removed from you, and my covenant of peace will not be shaken, says the Lord who has compassion on you. Now, one of the big things about the Noahic covenant is where is it in our Bible, right? If we're going to look this up, there's a lot of chapters on Noah. And it's funny because there's some discussion about where the actual covenant is. Now, you could start with Genesis 8, some people say, right? Now, others say, no, don't look at Genesis 8. That's just the mind of God, but that's kind of awesome to hear because we don't hear a lot of what's going on in God's mind. So let's go to Genesis 8, right? Genesis 8, starting in verse 15. Now, these aren't words spoken aloud so much. The beginning part will be, and then you're going to kind of see that God's just kind of thinking a poem out. But at the beginning, it is, we see what's happening as they leave the ark. So, okay, Genesis 8:15. Then God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives, bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. In other words, get out of the boat, people, okay? Totally normal. Not a promise there, just an action item needed to be done. So Noah came out together with his sons and his wife and his son's wife and all the animals and da-da-da-da, right? Then Noah builds an ark to the Lord. Oh, did I say ark? I'm so excited with the ark. Build an altar. Make sure I put that AR on there. Built an altar to the Lord. Taking some of the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. So what does Noah do when he gets out of this boat? I don't know about you. I might have run free and far from these animals as possible, right? But Noah does something really important. Noah gives thanks to God. Noah gives allegiance to God. Noah says, thank you, God, for getting us through this. And honors God with a sacrifice. Honors God with an offering. And so here's God, being God, right? And it says, God smelled the pleasing aroma and said in his heart, never again Now, this is the mind of God. This is not the promise. Never again will I curse the ground because of humans, even though every inclination of the human heart is evil from childhood. And never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done. So we've seen just briefly into the mind of God. And it continues with this beautiful poem, which is Genesis 8, verse 22. As long as the earth endures, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So that's chapter 8. And in chapter 8, you've seen, so they get off the boat, Noah gives this sacrifice, God says, hey, that's kind of nice. And then God's like, maybe I won't do that again, right? Like, kind of feeling like emotional, right? There's a piece of God that's kind of almost human here, thinking things, right? The covenant with God is not exactly spoken aloud, right? But you're starting to see a prelude to it. You're starting to see an intro to it. You're starting to see a purpose coming forth. So if you turn the page to Genesis 9, you see what happens when that thought becomes a reality. It starts right at Genesis 9:1. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and on every creature that moves along the ground, and on the fish in the sea are given to your hands. So let me stop right already. So be fruitful and increase in number, okay? And then 2, fear of the beast, okay? That's important. Just start to hear these in your head. Everything that lives and moves about you will be food for you, okay? Everything that is now option of food. Just as I gave you green plants, I now give you everything. But you must not eat meat that has lifeblood still in it. You can't eat the blood of animals. And for lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting for every animal, and from each human being too. I will demand an accounting of life for another human being. So don't kill another human being. Whoever sheds human blood by human, shall their blood be shed. For the image of God has God made mankind. Image of God, right? We're made in the image of God. And as for you, be fruitful and multiply and increase on the earth. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, I now establish my covenant. So it's Genesis 9, verse 9. I now establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, the birds, the livestock, all the wild animals, and all those that came out of the ark with you, every living creature on earth. I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will be there a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all the living creatures of all kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the cloud, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on earth. So God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all life on the earth. Now, I read you that whole thing because it's really important, all of those pieces, right? That's the fullness of the covenant, 9:1 through 17. So you got that prelude in Genesis 8, but you really have it clearly defined like a legal document in 9. There's a lot of pieces to that, and we're going to break some of those down. But think of it almost as a legal document God has given to you of an assurance, of a promise that this is what's going on. This is what will never happen again because of this, and this is what will happen because of this. The Noahic covenant has these divine promises that accompany it. It's God's commitment to the preservation of life on earth. Now, I want you to think first with me before we jump too far in, what's happened to this point in Genesis, right? You've had the beginning of Genesis with creation and Adam and Eve, and they got in a little bit of trouble, as we know, and get kicked out, and then their sons aren't so great, right? One kills another one, and then you've got Babel where they're like making this tower, and there's some really not great stuff humanity's done, right? And so this human sin has come into the world, human pain to each other, right? Lies and murder and just so many things are ratcheting up that humanity has done wrong. And that's why we know the flood was created, right? As this refreshing of life. But what God is saying here is that in spite of human sin, I'm going to guarantee life. I'm going to give a story of redemption. I'm going to give you a promise that I see life as important, even if you don't, humanity. The Noahic covenant is this very strange thing because unlike almost any other covenant, this is an unconditional covenant. It does not depend on Noah doing anything. It doesn't depend on his family. It doesn't depend on you and me doing anything because God knows that we're going to mess it up, right? God has seen so much human sin that God is saying, wow, can't trust humanity to carry on their part in the matter, which later on the other covenants are going to be a little different, and we'll see how those go as the weeks go on, right? But for this covenant, this is an unconditional covenant. The promise is based on God's faithfulness alone. We think almost of the solas of the Reformation, right? In grace alone, in faith alone. That's kind of what's happening here. It's not, our salvation is not dependent on our works, right? It's based on Jesus' acts. And here, this covenant is not based on humanity doing anything right. It's an understanding that humanity is probably not going to do anything right. And yet God will do right. God will protect the world and creation and animals and humans, even when the wickedness of humanity tries to unravel it. There is no condition under which God will renege on this promise. So this idea, right, this unconditional covenant is very different than what we're going to see later on. There's nothing that we can do so bad that God will ignore what God says in this moment. Now, God says this, there's going to be a sign of a rainbow, and we're going to see what that means in a little bit. But I want you to think about it first as what this even means, right? So here's Noah coming off this ship after it has rained and he's been tossed and turned. And then God says, Noah, you saw how bad humanity went. And I got angry. But no longer will that anger be a reality because I know that humanity is going to let me down. And so when it rains, I don't want you to be afraid. Imagine with me, like if you had seen 40 days of rain, how afraid you would be when it sprinkles, right? You can walk outside in a rainstorm and not freak out wondering, is it never going to stop? But Noah would feel that way, right? Noah would wonder, oh my goodness, the next time it rains, is this another flood? Should I build a boat, right? So when he sees this rainbow, it's a sign of reassurance for Noah and a sign of reassurance for us. That we're like, I guess we're going to bring an umbrella. We don't have to think we need to build a boat. But the sign is not a commitment sign like the other signs will be in the covenants. Each covenant will have an accompanying sign, kind of like an artistic image or an action, right? There's something about each covenant that we can say, hey, that's to remind us of this legal document. And the rainbow is that. But who is the sign for? Well, it gives us reassurance, but it's not really for us. In the text, it says very clearly, I will see the covenant and I will remember. God will remember. The rainbow is not for humanity, it's for God. When God sees it, God will remember the relationship and the respective obligations to that relationship. When God sees the rainbow, it will be a moment for God to say, no matter what is happening, I will love them as my children. And so there's a theologian named Harland who says, in Hebrew, memory was not just recollection of putting into effect of an action, when it's actually the action itself. So when God remembers, he intervenes. When God sees a rainbow, God says, oh, right, okay. Now, we do this too at times, right? We might put a message on the fridge saying, don't forget the milk, right? And the next time we go to open the fridge and we're like, oh, right, we need to pick up milk, right? It's just this kind of idea, right? That's what the rainbow is. The rainbow is there to say, right, okay, don't forget that I made that commitment. Now, another thing about this one that's different is it's a universal commitment. I kind of mentioned that earlier, right? Some of the commitments and covenants we're going to see, some of the promises are just for a small group of people, like a line of David or Moses and the Israelites. But here, this covenant is not limited in that way. We call it a universal covenant. It includes humankind, it includes animals, it includes creation itself. Although God is concerned with the fate of human beings, it's not an exclusive concern. God reaches out to all of creation, just like at Genesis. All is cared for by God. Humans begin this kind of weird relationship with animals, though. It's going to shift now. At creation, some say that Adam and Eve were vegetarians because it's here in this Noahic covenant that it says, okay, you can eat more than just green plants. You can eat these animals now. And what does the covenant also tell us? That animals will then fear us. That's new. That wasn't at Genesis. While we had dominion over them, we were to use it to wisely, to care and support them. Here now it says, go ahead, eat your cow, right? There's a shift here. I bet you didn't know that part of the covenant, did you? But that's true. If you had bacon this morning, you can thanks Noah, right? There's a shift here. And it changes the dynamic between humanity and animals, though, as well. But not completely. Because God will say, you can't just way nay whatever you want with animals. You can't eat their lifeblood. Because human life and animal life is sacred. So understand that life is sacred. And this is a part of this covenant. It's part of this whole message to Noah and to us. That life matters. And this covenant is to the rocks and the soil and the sand and everything. But remember, when God created in Genesis, God says, ooh, that's good. Ooh, that's good, right? I did good. But here there's none of that. Because God knows that humanity is going to mess it up. So God is reaching out this covenant even if it isn't good. And we know that it's to successful generation, the following Noah, right, his children and those who come after, like you and me, because it even says that it will be for all generations. There's no ending to this covenant. I want you to think about what it would be like to be Noah now, right? We've done a little bit of this morning, but I read something online that was kind of funny to think about. Like Noah in today's world, in this year, God comes to Noah and says, once again, the earth has become wicked and overpopulated, and I see the end of everything before me. I need you to build an ark, Noah. Right now in 2021, I need you to build an ark. We have had some rough times lately. We know humanity's going down a weird path. Let's get an ark going and get in some good people and get in some animals. And God gives Noah the blueprints. And then God comes back 6 months later to check in 2021. And Noah's got nothing done. In fact, instead, Noah is crying in the yard. And God's like, Noah, there's a flood on the way. Where is the ark? What have you done? And Noah looks at God and says, forgive me, Lord, but things have changed. Now I need a building permit. And I've been arguing with a boat inspector about the need for a solid sprinkling system. And my homeowner association claimed that it's against neighborhood laws to build an ark in my backyard. And the planning committee insists that they need a decision, but they're not meeting for a couple months yet. And then the electricity company declared that they're going to have to change some power lines if I build this ark in space. And they're not hearing any of that. And then I got to try to get the wood, but some of the wood has been banned from use, and then I gotta go to the store, and the amount that I need to buy, there's questions about that. And then I started trying to collect animals, but then I was taken to court because I'm gathering wild animals, and they're wondering if I'm being cruel and inhuman to them, putting them in a confined space. And then the Environmental Protection Agency said that if this flood is happening, am I the cause of it? And they're beginning to question me, and it's all getting very complicated, God. Think about that. right? I love that thought. How much more difficult it would be. Those of you at First United Methodist Church know that we've been dealing with kind of issues about approval, right? And permits. And this has been keeping our church closed because of some of these struggles, right? And just think about what it would be to build an ark now and how hard this would be. So good thing this covenant is for all generations, because you watching this do not have to build an ark in your own backyard right now. Because that commitment, that promise to Noah is as solid to you as it was to Noah. And so this is a reaffirmation to all time, to all things, that God is saying, no matter what creation does wrong, I will stand beside it. I will be with it. Now, not everything's going to be the same as God had planned, right? The dynamic between humans and animals shifted. The way God thought humanity would act has shifted. But God is once again establishing the sacredness of creation. Now, part of what that means is that God is making kind of Noah a new Adam. Jesus will officially be the new Adam, but this again is this, okay, as first man, Noah, what will you be dealing with? And I got to tell you, Noah's not great. Right? Noah is righteous. But as soon as Noah gets off the ark, you know what his first thing he does is? He builds the first vineyard and he gets drunk. So to the point where it ends up getting some issues with his own family, and then some of them get cursed, and the first family-ish dynamics of this new world, right? We saw family bad dynamics in the old world with the sons of Adam and Eve, but already with his sons we're getting this. So clearly nothing has changed in the way of humanity's responses. As righteous as Noah is, he's not perfect. And we don't have to be. The new Adam of Noah is just a broken man, a broken person, and yet God loves us in that way still. God says, even in your brokenness, I will be with you. Even in your brokenness, I will love you. Your life is precious to me. Now, thinking about that and thinking about what the preciousness of life means, there is this notion that God makes very clearly a part of this covenant that we cannot take life away from other people. It's very clearly stated as part of the covenant. So when you see that rainbow, right, you might not remember, but God's saying you can't kill other people, or you too will be punished by me. Life comes from me, and life should only be taken by me. That's a part of that covenant too. Now, some of you are saying, well, the covenant's really just about that God's never going to destroy the earth. Well, it doesn't exactly say that either, right? The covenant of Noah says that God will never flood the earth. In 2 Peter 3:10, it says, but the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire. And the earth and everything done it will be laid bare. So it's said in the Bible, the next destruction will be by fire. But it's not going to be God saying, humanity, you didn't do right by me. Because God already knows that at this point, right? That drunken stupper that shows up in the same chapter of Noah reminds us that it's okay. We don't have to be perfect. Christ will come and give that salvation. Christ will come and make it okay. God points to this human creation as a commitment irrespective of human sin. Guaranteed life that will flourish, right? That is part of the beauty of this covenant. So we have talked a lot about Noahic covenant. We've talked about the extent of what's going on here. We've talked about the layout of it that we don't often think of. We sometimes just think of the rainbow and that's it. And we're reminded that that rainbow is actually for God and not even for us, right? But what I really want you to know about this first covenant, what I really want you to know about the first promise God makes to you, think about it that way. The first commitment, the first promise that God made to you was that life matters, that you matter. No matter how many mistakes you make, no matter how many mistakes I make, God shows you over and over that no matter what we do wrong, I'm going to be there with you. So that covenant that Noah received was the first promise that God's not going to leave us alone, even in our brokenness. That's a pretty awesome covenant. All right, friends, just a heads up, next week we will not jump into the next covenant. Next week I actually will be posting, we're going to have, this week coming up is annual conference, and I will be getting ordained as part of that annual conference. There will be a live stream if you want to watch it live, but on Sunday what I'm going to do is also repost that. It'll have the bishop's sermon and have the ordination of service, the ritual, and I think that's good for us to see and to be reminded that this is one of our rituals of our faith. So I will be doing all kinds of stuff next week, and so I'm going to also just take this as a moment to live into that ritual and live into that faith and moment. So next week you'll have the ordination played out on Sunday, and then the following week we will come back to the next covenant. All right, I'll see you then.